Governor J.B. Pritzker was in New York yesterday selling bonds to bond buyers. And what that means for you, the taxpayer, is the governor's looking to put the states into more debt that'll have an interest rate tacked onto it that taxpayers will have to pay those debts back. And a variety of bonds being offered, around $2.45 billion bonds. And you had the governor in front of investors, including the governor's chief investment officer in front of the investors during a presentation and saying that they've got a whole host of different bonds they're looking to sell, and they're looking to do that this week. And that official will hear from first, followed by the governor. You've got Illinois Director of Capital Markets Paul Chatelass saying that they're looking to go to market by Wednesday for these bonds that they're offering up. What's the governor's pitch here? Well, I took out about, it's an hour and a half roughly of presentation and Q&A, and I took out some of the highlights. But we'll also hear from Ted Dabrowski of Wirepoints, an independent voice, to evaluate the state of the state, so to speak, when it comes to offering up these bonds and who's really going to be impacted by what the governor has to say. So here are the officials from Illinois in front of New York bond investors yesterday.
We are looking to go to market on Wednesday if the market cooperates. It's for a number of different purposes that the governor touched on this morning. The biggest is the capital piece for Rebuild Illinois and other capital projects. We have a taxable series that will fund the pension acceleration portion. We have an IT portion, and then we are looking to do a refunding for savings as the market allows.
Because we passed our infrastructure bill in 2019, when the federal bill was passed and you have to come up with your matching dollars, we were ready to go. We literally were shovel ready with projects in Illinois because we'd been at this for 2 years already. And so what do you know? I think we're now the second highest amount of money that's been granted to a state by the federal government, in part because we had the dollars ready to go. We broadened the sales tax. I'll go back one. We broadened the sales tax in Illinois to cover online retail. We closed some corporate loopholes that really were unlike any other state, and so we brought ourselves in line with a lot of other states. And then we negotiated a bunch of health insurance contract savings, which have brought ongoing savings for the state. And then by paying off our short-term and medium-term debt, and really we have no short and medium-term debt left in the state. We've paid everything. We found every nook and cranny. I mean, if there's something left, it's relatively smaller than anybody would pay attention to. What percent of our budget needs to be dedicated to paying the pensions in the state of Illinois? And the graph that I have, with the projections going forward, is that number is at or below 20% of our budget. Now, that you may think that's a large number, but that number was more before I came into office, and it's come down steadily. And going 2045 is when that 50-year timeline ends, and we will be at 90% funded or better. And I always say that I want to be the guy who becomes governor in 2046. So he doesn't have the pension challenge that we have today. But as long as that percent of the budget remains at 20% or below, it's manageable for the state. So it's not something we need to panic about or that needs massive structural change. Again, I'm always looking for ways to address this, but I want to remind you that we have addressed it. We passed a Tier 2 pension system in Illinois before I was governor, in fact.
So Governor J.B. Pritzker again there talking about the state's finances and the challenges he says are still there, but also backing up those challenges with tax revenue from a variety of sources. He says the state has increased, including those online sales that is bringing in a fair amount of revenue for state coffers to continue to spend. And the state's proposed budget that the governor has is close to $50 billion in spending. And questions about are we going to be able to sustain any kind of economic downturn? Well, I reached out to independent analysis from Wirepoints, and Wirepoints President Ted Dabrowski chatted with me yesterday and gave his initial reaction to what he heard from that presentation.
Well, the biggest takeaway is that, yes, Illinois' finances are better for bondholders. And there's a big reason why. It's the massive inflow of federal dollars that came in during COVID. Over $188 billion alone came to Illinois public and private sector. And that for the last 2.5 years, 3 years, has just filled the coffers with extra tax. And the good news is that if you're a bondholder, you're in a much better position because Illinois' financial condition, as far as repayment of debt to bondholders, has improved. Bondholders are first in line to get repaid, and so if the numbers are better, then they're better off. So good news for them. But I think there's a big disconnect between bondholders and what happens to ordinary people in Illinois, and that's the real story that needs to be told.
And Dabrowski also highlighting how the tax situation in Illinois may be helping out those bondholders, but it's you, the taxpayer, that's in an outlier state with higher than average taxes across the board, from sales taxes to property taxes and so on. Another thing that the governor talked about was the state's credit rating, saying that, hey, the state's credit rating saw 8 upgrades after having 8 downgrades under former Governor Bruce Rauner, but there were even more downgrades under a Democratic governor, Pat Quinn, before that. But Pritzker's heralded these 8 upgrades, regardless of the state still being at the bottom of the barrel, tied with, I believe, New Jersey for the worst credit rating in the country. Here's Dabrowski reacting to some of that tax and spend.
Well, yeah, I mean, the bondholders, the more revenues they see coming into the state government, the more happy they are because they get paid first. They always have the first in the line. So ordinary people suffer from it, whether it's higher property taxes or higher income taxes or higher sales taxes. Ordinary people suffer more, but the bondholders are happy. And it's one of the big reasons why there were so many upgrades. The governor touted the 8 credit upgrades that the rating agencies gave to Illinois, and that is correct, and that's true, and that's good for the bondholders because it means they're safer. But all it did was really unwind what happened under the Rauner years. There were 8 downgrades under Rauner, so we're back to square one there. But even before Rauner, we had 13 credit downgrades under Quinn, so we still have a long way to go. And of course, we did this catch-up just now because of the federal bailout money, not because Illinois did something where it grew its economy, we grew more people and all that. No, it was strictly because of the bailouts.
So Dabrowski highlighting the federal money, federal tax funds that came into Illinois from COVID-19 relief. And it wasn't just, the public sector. It was the private sector getting a whole host of funds as well, $180 billion in both public and private sector. And that, again, taxes get paid from the transactions and so on. So you could see Illinois getting it. But Dabrowski says the state's not really prepared for an economic downturn. We'll hear more from him coming up here on WMAY. Stay tuned. It is Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg. Hearing some of the reaction of Governor J.B. Pritzker and state officials in New York looking to sell bonds, which translation for taxpayers means to put the state more into debt with interest rates that have yet to be seen. We don't know what kind of interest rates we're going to get for the $2.45 billion in various general obligation bonds. But that obviously is something that's going to cost taxpayers. But the governor was chatting with investors, and in particular, he also talked about pensions and said, hey, he's working to get pensions shored up. They've got the pension buyout program that he says is successful, and they expanded. He also talked about how he's putting more into the pension system than is statutorily required. But he also said, hey, listen, we've gone from 1 out of every $4 going to pensions to now 1 out of every $5, about 20% or so. And he says that's not a massive problem to be frightened by, nor does it call for structural reforms. But Ted Dabrowski from Wirepoints sees it a bit different.
Well, again, bondholders are first in line, so they'll get paid off before pensioners. But the fact that so much money that came into the state did put some temporary relief into the pension funds. What's fascinating, too, is the governor mentioned that things will be better in that the budget will only be eaten up, or 20% of the budget will be eaten up by pensions going forward, compared to about 25% before. The problem is that, if you look around the rest of the country, most states pensions only eat up 3 to 4 to 5% of their budget. We're at 20%, so we're always at a massive disadvantage, both from an economy and from taxpayers having to bear that burden and pay down that debt. So the pension problem is being downplayed, but it's a massive problem, and it will continue to eat at Illinoisans, at their taxes, and at the economy for a long, long time. He hasn't talked about pension reform at all, and I think that still needs to be number one on the list for finances.
So I don't know if that pension reform is going to be politically popular. It's been a conversation around the State House from some for years, but really hasn't advanced. I mean, you do have the reforms by way of the buyout program and so on, but is that going to be enough to shore up the nearly $140 billion in unfunded liability just for the state's 5 public pension funds? But Dabrowski also talked about gas taxes, and that's something else the governor highlighted. He said, hey, we've got a lot of gas taxes coming in, and that set us up to be able to get a share of federal dollars so that we're shovel ready for projects. But keep in mind, in 2019, we doubled the state's gas tax, and there's an annual increase every year thereafter tied to inflation, plus the increased fees for various driving-related things. But Dabrowski says, yeah, we pay among the highest gas taxes in the country.
Well, yeah, it's pretty confusing, right? We already pay the second highest gas taxes in the country. California is number 1, Illinois is number 2, and so that pushes up our gas prices, and people feel the pain of that. But a lot of those gas taxes are going for capital projects, and billions of dollars in capital projects that have been planned in Illinois. But at the same time, there's all this capital money coming from the federal government, which means Illinois will have to pay higher federal taxes to fund all that. So it's hard to tell what the mess really looks like, but you can count on the Illinois taxpayer paying higher taxes in Illinois for those capital bills and federal taxes to pay for the federal. There's a lot of boondoggles going on right now, and it's one of the reasons why Illinois will be suffering.
The governor also talked about education spending and working to get more K through 12 money, and he highlighted the success he says is happening in Illinois' K through 12 education. Dabrowski pushed back on that.
Governor Pritzker made some pretty big brags on education and spending much more. $1.4 billion more since he's gotten into office, and that hides the fact that Illinois, even before all that, was the 8th highest spender in education in the country. And what Governor Pritzker's not talking about are the horrendous results that we've had in education. There's no accountability in the education spending, where, as we talked about at Wirepoints, at a statewide level, only 3 out of every 10 kids can read at grade level. And when it comes to black students, it's only 1 out of every 10, and Hispanics, 2 out of every 10 kids can read at grade level. So there's this massive amount of money going in, and the results only get worse. And we have never heard of talks about accountability in terms of outcomes from Governor Pritzker, from the State Board of Education, and that day is due because they keep raising spending at the state level more and more.
And one thing that Dabrowski also said was there wasn't any talk yesterday at that bond investors meeting about violence.
One thing, what's fascinating is that nobody mentioned the crime issue and its impact on the state of Illinois.
And you got to imagine that might rattle some investors. It's definitely rattled some business owners. So obviously a conversation that will continue. The state looks to go out and sell those bonds tomorrow. Stay tuned, much more coming up.
From the Fly SPI